Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
No one comes up here. Written by Sumaiyah Tasneem. Narrated by James Cleveland. Featuring Erik Selsemeyer, Alicia Pavlis, David Alnwick, and Jesse Cornett.
I looked up from where I stood. Just a couple of steps and I would reach my destination. My heart hammered like a million pounding drums. My head was dizzy with excitement. Behind me, I heard my friends grunt and pant as they struggled, clambering over the jagged and broken rocks. I stood straight and proud as I took the final step, summiting the cliff. I gazed over my shoulder to check on my friends. They weren't far behind. "Come on, hurry up, we're almost there," I called.
Jackson, how far is it from here?
Alice asked as she managed to wrench herself forward. "It's right there, over that cliff." She continued walking, and some other people followed. In all honesty, I didn't know most of them. I had only brought them along because I needed a good support team. There were 7, including me. Adam, Alice, and Brad were the only ones with whom I was well acquainted. They were fit for the job and very obedient, exactly what I needed. I wasn't thrilled about the fact that I would have to share my money with them after we achieved our goal and handed our pictures over to the mayor, but I had made peace with it. My only goal right now was to climb up Channel Mountain, get some pictures, and climb back down. Channel Mountain, as the articles say, is this mountain with a flat top. The place has a massive number of trees all over it, except for this clean path running north to south. A clear, channel-like road, hence the name, Channel Mountain. There is a way up from one side and a safer way down from the other. No one before us has had the guts to come up here, so of course I decided to do it. Build my own team and use my own technology to show everyone what this place actually looked like. Naturally, the money we'd receive was a strong incentive. Finally, I reached the very edge. I held my breath and took the final step up, too excited to wait for the rest of them. That was when I first saw Channel Mountain. It had more of an impact in person than anything the articles had conveyed. The air was thick and misty, like a cold cloud of shriveling fog. My breath froze within me at the very sight of it. The sky suddenly looked pale. There was a clear road at the center, and the corners stood lush, oddly shaped lines of trees. Their branches stretched long and far from the trunks. The trees looked quite healthy and well tended. Strange, I thought, as there was no one else up here to look after them. At least, that's what the article said. The path reached into the distance, as far as my eyes could see. It looked almost endless. The area ahead of me was blurred and obscured by the thick fog hanging in the air like stone-cold smoke. I admired what lay in front of me. That's when a strange feeling ignited and stirred inside my gut. A burning sensation, somewhere between foreboding and guilt. A feeling that warned me of danger, demanding that I turn away. I wanted to turn around and maybe forget about the whole thing, but my team finally caught up with me. and I heard most of them gasp when they saw what I saw.
Oh my God.
One of them said. There was a pause as my friends absorbed the atmosphere of the roadway.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Never seen anything like this.
Is this the place?
Brad asked, his voice raspy.
Why does it feel so... creepy?
No, it wasn't creepy. Creepy wasn't the word to describe it. It was more unsettling. There was a visceral feeling of dangerous uncertainty flowing through the air of the place. No word I could think of was powerful or accurate enough to describe what we felt. I was just a tiny inch away from the mist of the forest. Just one more step and I would physically feel the fog. It took every ounce of willpower in me to convince myself to move on. But I reminded myself of the money and what I had put myself and my team through to get up here in the first place. We had already climbed for God knows how long to get to the top. After that much effort, I was quite sure no one would want to turn back. After all, the end of the mountain was a long way back down. Besides, the walk along the road wasn't that long either. It shouldn't take us more than 30 minutes to get to the other side.
Well, I guess we should get moving,
I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. My voice came out cracked and unconvincing. I took a step forward, then slowly and steadily stepped into the mist. The white fog gently stroked my skin, leaving light goosebumps all over me. I trembled a bit. Then, without warning, a feeling of dread poured over me, making me regret my decision almost immediately. Nothing about the place felt right. Darkness swept through my mind. I felt it, an extra presence. Someone or something apart from the other members of my team. Although no one was seen, there was a presence. I could feel it. An evil, deceptive danger watching us as we took every breath. My friends were utterly silent. Looking at them, I could see their fear. It was written all over their faces. They all wanted to turn back, but no one wanted to admit it. No one wanted to be the first one to snap under the pressure. After another pause, I continued to walk. Our footsteps echoed through the empty space. It was like walking through an empty, hollow shell. Our breathing had become unsettled and sharp as we kept alert, our eyes wide open and our ears sharper than ever. Adam, our camera boy, was immersed in his work. He snapped his flashlight at everything he saw. Everything of recording he documented to be taken back as the evidence needed to collect our prize money. Glancing down, I noticed that even the grass around the bases of the trees looked odd, like thin green needles found inside vaccination syringes. We walked around for 3 minutes, and some people began to complain.
Why are we even here? Is this even worth it?
Brad was starting his usual annoying behavior. At the moment, I had no interest in dealing with it.
For all the money we'd get, yes, it is,
I said, firmly. I was clearly lying to myself, but I couldn't let anyone see my weakness or question me at this point.
How do you know if there's even a way down? No one comes up here,
said Brad.
The articles predicted there would be.
They predicted. How would you know for sure we can get out of here?
Brad questioned.
He's got a point.
Alice cut in hesitantly, trying to make it look like she wasn't taking anyone's side. Everyone thought for a while. Then their half-expectant and half-angry eyes gazed at me, demanding an explanation. Of course, it was my plan. and by extension, problems that arose were my fault. But really, who wouldn't want a lifetime supply of money?
Guys,
I began.
this is not the time to blame each other.
Their faces looked more disapproving.
Look, we'll get out of here, I promise.
And what if we don't? It'll be your fault.
Brad was clearly not about to let this go. I sighed. Why did I bring him along?
Guys, look, for now, just trust me. Right at the end of this path, there is a way down. We'll just have to keep walking.
Everyone else seemed more relaxed as a result of my front of certainty, but Brad refused to budge.
So you got us up here without even knowing the goddamned way out?
I just told you how to get down.
I shot back.
You said the article predicted. How does predicted suggest anything close to certainty?
He was like an annoying 10-year-old. That's when I lost it.
Brad, if you don't shut up, I'll throw you down the cliff. If you stop being such a jerk, we can all leave this place with our sanity.
See? It's absolutely clear you don't know what you're doing.
My blood began to boil. He was right. All that he said was right, and that's what pissed me off.
Just shut up!
I screamed at him at the top of my lungs, almost tearing my vocal cords with the ferocity. Brad fell silent. Everyone fell silent. At first, I thought it was because of my outburst. But then I realized he wasn't looking at me. None of them were. They stared way past me, their eyes reflecting pure, underlying horror. I followed their gazes. It led into the dense line of trees. For a minute, I couldn't comprehend what had scared them so. Then I saw it. At first, relief washed through me. It looked like a figure of a lady, faded and unclear through the mist. She walked closer. I noticed her features grow more and more defined with every step. I noticed that she was tall, really tall. I noticed that her skin was covered in scars. No, not scars. It looked more like the skin on her body was actually tattered or frayed, like some sort of fabric. I noticed that her limbs were really long. I noticed she only had a few grass-like hairs on her head. I noticed how awkwardly she walked in stiff, jerky movements. When she finally came into clear view, I understood why my friends looked so terrified. Just a few meters away stood the ugliest, weirdest creature I had ever seen. A sight which would haunt our memories for the rest of our living minutes. She breathed like a tire deflating. Her head was covered by a few patches of grass. Her torso stretched to 7 feet high, and her arms were like long, lanky pieces of wood. Her skin resembled the flaked fiber of wooden trunks. She had only one eye, on the left, which was a pure silver color. It had no iris, but I could tell it was looking straight at us. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Her eyeball rolled from me to Alice, then to Brad, then to Adam, then to the rest of us. From the corner of my eye, I saw Adam step forward and place his eye at the lens of the camera, crouching slightly to get a good shot of it.
Adam, no!
I tried to warn him, but it was too late. Adam pressed the trigger. The light flared from his camera and right into the thing's beady little eyeball. The creature flinched in shock, letting out the most haunting and blood-curdling scream. Her scream echoed in our ears, ringing like a million sirens. She crouched down on all fours and in the blink of an eye charged straight at us. Alice screamed as she sprinted in the opposite direction. Without thinking, we ran after her. We were running the wrong way, I knew, but it was too late. We had to escape from that thing. Adrenaline shot through my body as I felt my heart pound loudly in my ears. We ran blindly along that path of fog, which became thicker and thicker as we ran.
I think we lost her!
Brad screamed, his voice hoarse. We slowed our pace, but remained on high alert. The fog was thicker now, like a solid cloud. All the members in our party were close by, but they looked like faded shadows, like thin fragments.
What the hell was that?
Adam yelled, gasping for breath.
Why don't you ask the guy who got us into this?
I could feel Brad's gaze on me.
Did you even know that creature lives up here?
How would I?
So you didn't know anything about this? I knew it. I just knew it. You just got us here for that stupid money, didn't you?
Brad yelled, his voice echoing through the forest. As he ranted, my mind could only think that, God forbid, he might attract that creature again.
Brad, just shut up. She might hear us.
I'm not shutting up until you admit that I'm right.
I didn't know we'd get a visit from Mrs. Horrifying Plant Lady, all right? The articles said nothing about any of that.
Why the hell would anyone rely on some stupid random article at the back of a paper no one reads? Is that the sort of thing you use to make important life decisions?
That's enough, Brad. Stay quiet or she'll come back.
Adam cut in, coming to my defense.
We should probably go to the other side of this place. That's the way down.
I could tell he was speaking to me.
All right, is everyone here?
I asked. Everyone answered like a disjointed roll call, but I could feel someone's absence.
Wait, where's Alice?
Everyone gazed at each other, scanning to find the brunette in the mist.
She was right here in front of me.
Adam said, unable to disguise the panic in his voice. Everyone was growing frantic with fear. Our breathing was getting faster, irregular, and we shuffled nervously on the dry, sandy path as we continued searching for our friend.
The trees!
Adam finally said.
Maybe she went into the forest.
His voice was trying to reassure himself as much as comfort others.
Yeah, maybe she did.
My throat was like sandpaper.
But what about that monster?
Someone yelled.
She must be quite far behind us by now. We ran for quite a long time,
I said, and stepped forward, ignoring any further protest. Everyone headed to the dense canopy of trees. I felt my shoe dig into the surprisingly wet mud. My feet sank in, and I had to struggle to take one step at a time. No one complained. They all just wanted to find Alice and get out of this weird place. Just a few steps in, someone nearly lost their mind.
Guys, it feels like the mud's sucking me in.
Adam said in a voice of alarm.
It's just mud, Adam. Grow up.
Brad scolded. But I, too, could feel something going on in the mud. I did feel suction, a pull from below.
I feel it,
someone said.
I feel it too!
Another admitted.
Well, I don't.
Brad rolled his eyes.
Grow up, all of you. We need to...
His sentence was interrupted. Without any warning, Brad went down. He didn't lose his balance and stumble. He didn't trip over anything. To all our horror, we watched as Brad was sucked into the muddy, wet ground like it was a giant vacuum cleaner. It happened so fast it was over almost before I could process what I was seeing. And the last thing we saw of him was his hand, with his Rolex watch reaching out of the mud, desperately trying to claw his way to the surface. Adam lunged to his rescue.
No. Brad,
But within a second, he fell in too, and was quickly submerged in the muck. I heard someone scream, then everyone burst into panic. We tried to run, but the mud was growing thicker and heavier, and worst of all, harder. Hard enough to slow us down. In matters of seconds, everyone around me was sucked in, one by one. I watched helplessly as my friends disappeared, and then, suddenly I was alone. For a second, nothing happened. I was left with white, thick, suffocating fog, and with a curtain of dead silence falling all around me. I knew I was about to be the final victim. I knew I was being watched. I knew I was being saved for the last. And I felt it. The iron grip of a giant, ragged hand wrap around my ankle. I was next. The hand pulled me down with unimaginable strength and force. At first, I felt my body move down wet mud, and then I simply felt like I was falling. It was just a couple of seconds until a long, rough, coil-like structure wrapped around me, holding me firmly in place. I coughed as my throat burned from the mud inside. I gasped for breath and opened my eyes. My jaw hung open at what I saw. On top of me was a large dome of soil with roots hanging down, looking thick and healthy. From the dome protruded an endless number of giant roots, each of which held something at its end in tight, round coils. I wanted to scream when I realized what were in the coils. They were bony remains, human remains, and now I was coiled in just like them. Around me, all my friends were also held tightly in their own coils, all screaming in despair. It took me a moment to realize precisely at what they were screaming. Then I saw them. At the tops of the roots were tiny little creatures, miniature versions of the plant lady we saw earlier. Millions of them crouched on all fours, their silver eyes glaring down at us in a combination of surprise, amusement, and awe. They made the same horrible sound their mother did, and began to crawl down the roots, coming straight for us. I heard Alice scream, and realized that she was on the coil right next to me. The grubby little creatures climbed on her body. I saw one of them sink its teeth into her arm. She screamed in pain, and I felt paralyzed with fear. The same happened to everyone. One by one, I saw their blood, I saw their bones, and I heard their cries grow muffled, and then cease entirely as the creatures devoured them alive. When finally the creatures cleared away from the coils, I saw the remains of all my friends. These people, alive just minutes ago, now lay broken and twisted in the grips of the coil-like rag dolls. Their flesh and muscles pulled away from their bones. Those creatures must have enjoyed my expression of pure horror. Then they began to crawl toward me. I was their main course. I could barely whimper as I struggled on the root coils, trying to pry them off me, trying to cut them with my teeth, trying to do anything to break their fierce grip on me. The coils had the sturdiness of hard cement. There was no escape. The creatures climbed onto my body, and still I fought the inevitable, trying everything to push them away. But just as they descended on me, a loud, ragged voice spoke.
Now, children, leave the last one for mommy.
Those words froze every muscle in my body. I saw her appear as her children scurried away. Her tree bark-like mouth parted into a gruesome grin.
You're a good one,
she said as her enormous hand squeezed my leg.
You've got some nice fleshiness and some grubbery muscle.
Her hands released me from the coils as she clasped me in her palm.
I'm glad you're here,
she said happily, sitting down cross-legged on the ground like she was getting ready to have a picnic.
I haven't had such a good meal in ages. After all, no one comes up here.
I screamed as loud as I could, but ignoring my cries, she closed her mouth around my head. I shut my eyes, awaiting the end. A moist, warm gush of wind rushed around my head. Her twig-like teeth pierced the flesh of my neck, and I felt a forceful pull on my head. The excruciating pain overwhelmed me. Every second brought new depths of agony and terror. Finally, just when I could take no more, my vision went black. After that, I felt nothing.
The Skin Collector by Corban Groshek. Jessie wondered if she and her brother would have more in common if they had been identical twins. The differences didn't surface unless you spent several days watching them. Minus the lack of identical faces, they seemed to have the same bond that every other pair of twins had. They could finish each other's sentences. They could communicate with the flash of a glance or eye movement. Yet, as close as they were as siblings, they were still far apart as individuals. Alec was a gun nut, as much as he could be without having his own. He read the magazines, knew all the makes and specs by heart, down to the magazine capacities and body mods and all else. That uncle that could talk about cars for 3 hours and you never understood a word? That's how Alec was with guns. Yet he was cool-headed and aimed with a steady hand when his dad took him to the firing range. So, where Alec enjoyed blowing things up, Jessie liked blowing things out of proportion. Her parents swore that she would become a journalist, as much as she loved sticking her nose in other people's business. Hey, she might as well get paid for it. One thing they would be sharing, like it or not, was the new car that their dad bought for their 16th birthday. The twins had already shared everything else. Their living space, their food, their beds, their secrets. Sharing a car wouldn't be an issue.
Happy birthday, kids!
Oh. Jessie came unglued when she was led outside with her brother, both of them blindfolded, and then the blindfolds were snapped off to reveal the dull, slightly rusted Plymouth with powder blue paint freckled with rust. The brightest part of the car was the sloppy gift ribbon that had been wrapped around it. Jessie forgot all about supper and couldn't contain her excitement, begging her parents to let her and Alec take it out for a drive right then. They agreed on 2 conditions. 1, the more level-headed of the siblings would drive, and they all knew that meant Alec. 2, they would check in every 15 minutes. That last condition was more their mother's than anyone else's. There had been a rash of disappearances in the area. It was a prickly frustration to officials because the targets had no rhyme or reason, no consistent age or location. Rich, poor, north, south, east, or west. It didn't matter. They had found a warm body to pin the crimes on, an unshorn and bug-eyed character that was barely fit to stand trial. He was the type that would take responsibility for the extinction of the dinosaurs if asked. But he pleaded guilty to the kidnappings, spouting wild and incoherent explanations for motives and locations of disposal and so forth, giving law enforcement and forensics a thick and chunky soup of logic to wade through. It was better than nothing. Better than believing the monster was still out there. The whole thing blew over just before spring, and by the time the twins had a new car to play with, it was the first chill of autumn. But parental instincts run deep and will make good moms and dads jump at shadows long after there's no longer a threat casting them. Alec was driving, and Jessie had shotgun. She lazed back, her feet up on the dashboard. The joke was on them, really. They thought that they were getting extra freedom and their dad was a really awesome guy. Which he was, but his gift wasn't completely unselfish. Now, they could drive themselves to school. They lived out in the sticks, and making it to school on time had meant a rise and shine that their parents never got used to. Not anymore. Better yet, the news that they would be carpooling by themselves was received with nothing but joyful teenage capering. And so, the twins cruised. Jessie couldn't leave the radio alone. Alec enjoyed himself also, just silently. Before long, Mom was saying that it was time to head in, wherever they were. Alec agreed. He was tired in spite of the fun he was having. And he had to admit it. Jessie was exhausting. No amount of brotherly love would change that fact.
All right, let's go home,
he grunted. His sister sat bolt upright in her chair with worry lines splayed across her forehead, the universal sign that whining was about to commence.
Please take the long way home, Alec, please. You know you wanna.
I can't take the long way if I don't even know where we are.
And he didn't. They had meandered so much that he had lost his bearings of where they sat on the rural map.
Just try to wander around a little more on the way home, you know? Like, don't go in a straight line to get there.
This is Obed County. It's impossible to go in a straight line on these back roads.
Please, come on!
Okay, I'll try.
Alec tried to steer towards anything interesting in the landscape. He slowed down for one last place. It looked to be an oversized barn. Its abandoned condition made it look like a gravestone. The length of the grass and weeds announced that nobody was taking care of the place. A gravel path led off to the property and wound around the opposite side of the barn. The barn was close enough to the country road that the twins could read the faded logo of a feed company that flaked off of the barn wall. The broad structure glowered at them as they glided behind the old oaks that shadowed the road. He and his sister gazed at the ancient building as it began to catch a few of the changing colors of the setting sun.
All right, yeah, that's it for our new car's maiden voyage,
Alex said as he sped up and opened his GPS app. Jessie continued to stare out the window.
We never really knew that place was there, did we?
Alec asked, talking to the back of his sister's head. She was fully turned toward the window.
Can you call Mom and tell her we're close?
He asked. No answer.
Will you call Mom?
She continued to stare out the window. He frowned to himself. 16 years old, and he was still the more mature of the two. She was pouting now that they had to go home. They had been driving around for the better part of an hour. There wasn't any reason to feel shortchanged. Then again, he didn't deal with the restless impulses that his sister did. Something inside of her was always eager to throw off the next restraint and rocket towards the next degree of freedom. From that standpoint, he could understand if she wasn't happy that they had to head in. He made the phone call to their mother, who was happy to hear that they were on their way. It had been a long hour for her. They pulled into the driveway of their 2-story ranch house. He killed the motor and looked over at his sister. She was still looking out the window.
What are you waiting for? Let's go,
he said. She didn't move a muscle. He scratched his head and got out of the car and walked around to open the passenger door for her. He tapped on his phone's flashlight and shone it in her face. Whatever she was staring at with her wide brown eyes, she didn't see or hear her brother. That's when he ran to get their parents. They wrapped her in a blanket and set her on the couch in front of the TV, where she stared intently but saw nothing. Then, after about 15 minutes, she started to come around just as their mother was about to call an ambulance. Alec was the first to notice that she was looking around.
Sis? Sis?
He grabbed her by her shoulders and gave her a brotherly shake.
I lost you for a minute there. What happened?
I saw Emma.
There was only one person that was as close to Jessie as her brother, and it was Emma. She was one of the missing persons. They never found her. Never found any trace of her. One minute she was there, and the next minute she wasn't. She vanished from her bedroom, no less. Nobody felt safe after hearing that, knowing that it wasn't simply a case of wrong place, wrong time. You weren't even safe in your own home. Tears carved paths down Jessie's face, her eyes looking less wild. Her parents sat on the couch on either side of her. Alec stood, with his hands in his pockets.
Wait, you say you saw Emma?
Her father said.
Yes.
Where did you see her?
On the wall of the barn.
They looked at Alec and he shook his head in denial.
Was she hanging like someone had hurt her?
She was climbing. She was sitting on the wall like a frog or like Spider-Man. She looked right at me. I mean, right at me. She wasn't looking at the car. She was looking at me.
Her family exchanged concerned looks with each other.
There were trees growing by the road, sis,
Alec added.
It wasn't that easy to see the barn. Maybe it was the light and the shadow of the leaves.
It wasn't,
she said.
It wasn't.
Here, she placed her face in one hand. The evening closed without any sense of finality. Jessie's family insisted that her eyes were playing tricks on her, and she wouldn't have it. The twins got in the car to go to school. Alec could pass as rested. Jessie looked the same as the night before, just without the tears. Alec watched her as closely as he could. They didn't have more than 2 classes together besides the lunch period. He noted that she tried to talk and smile with her friends, but the gloom in her eyes that settled in the night before was still there. It didn't leave for days, then weeks. It remained like a devil perched on her shoulder, clear up until the day when their mother came into the bedroom and announced that the usual road to the school was blocked off and that they'd have to find another way into town. It was when they had left the driveway that Jessie said,
"Could we drive by the barn again?"
Yes, the barn that hosted Jessie's hallucination was now referred to as the barn.
What? Why?
The road it's on goes into town and doesn't put us far from the school.
Alec eyed her.
Is that what I saw you looking at on Google Maps last night?
I just want to see it again.
Alec didn't. He didn't get the creeps from the place, but he didn't like what it was doing to his sister. Like any proper twin brother, when she hurt, he hurt. But he couldn't come up with a concrete reason as to why they couldn't drive by the old place on the way to school. So they did. A silence dragged on until they took a parking space at the school.
Did you see anything?
Alec muttered.
No,
she said. The school day came and went, and Jessie asked Alec to drive by the barn on the way home. She asked him to drive by the barn the next day, to and from school. And he went. He guessed that it was part of the healing process that nobody knew was unfinished. They hawked the place every day until their usual road reopened. One drive home, like any other, Jessie asked him to drive by the barn again. He was starting to lose track of how many times she had asked him to go by the place, and the weight of it all sat on him a little heavier each time. But he was a good brother, and he obliged. The great hulk of the old place came up over the bend again, and she asked him to slow down.
Stop the car, Alec.
The little car crept by the barn.
Stop the car.
She asked him to stop the car when they were in front of it.
Need to...
He looked at her.
Are you wanting to check the place out?
He asked.
No, I just want to listen.
He looked at all the mirrors, looked around them and hesitated. And then he killed the motor. The stillness of Obed County stole in and instantly lessened the weight of what they were doing. The breeze was a soothing whisper. Red-winged blackbirds trilled in the distance. Jessie wouldn't look at the barn. She just sat like she was tuning into her ears more than she was her eyes. And then, as if with much effort or with a stiff neck, she turned to look at the same wall where she thought she saw her friend.
You're still broken up over Emma, huh?
The sound of her brother's voice made her jump.
Sorry about that.
She nodded.
She was starting to fade away, and then I suddenly saw her, literally, climbing the wall. It was like something out of a nightmare. It was so cool to see her, and it was so scary all at once.
She chewed on one knuckle.
I just wanted to see her again, that's all. Because if I didn't see her, what did I see?
Alec eyed the mirrors. They were still alone on the road.
I still think I see Lucky. I see him pretty often, actually. That cat made more of an impression on me than I thought.
The attempt at small talk didn't get his sister to bite. There was a low sound, like distant thunder, that made the twins do a double take. A sort of low rumble could be felt in the body of the car. There was a half-empty Coke bottle in the drink holder, and the dark liquid rippled. Alec looked this way and that, looking for the thunderheads. The sky was clear. It grew louder. It was a purring roar like a panther, only heavier, thicker, and it peaked to a point where there was a shrill cry laid over it like a cry of pain or a distressed child. The sound made Jessie's insides twist and excited a terror in her without a nameable cause. Alec's instincts made him start the car and peel out. Both of them looked into each other's blanched faces. Alec was shaken but had his wits about him. His sister, though, looked like she had been kicked back into the dark place that she had just crawled out of. Then came the obvious questions.
What do you think that was?
She said. He didn't answer. She answered for him.
It sounded like exotic animals or something.
He nodded. He could see that her chest was rising and falling faster, then starting to pick up speed, like a piston.
If I saw Emma, and we then just heard animals like large cats...
She looked at him in mounting terror.
What if they're likely keeping large vicious animals in that barn and feeding people to them? Oh God, Alec, what if they're gonna feed Emma to a lion or a tiger or something?
Alec's eyes ticked back and forth as if looking for an exit, but he was in a moving car, so there wasn't one. Jessie's eyes were also bouncing around as she connected the dots, one terrifying connection after another, and she began babbling in a sort of panicked squeak, and she was getting louder. Alec began urging her to calm down, and he discovered that never in the history of telling someone else to calm down did they ever calm down when told to calm down. Jessie had become manic and babbled breathlessly all the rest of the way to the school.
Sis, knock it off!
Alec finally said, and just like that, she was quiet.
Let's go. Okay, I'm sorry. Just... let's go.
There didn't seem to be any further issues until the next day, at lunch. She was quiet for the ride up, but when Alec was carrying his lunch tray into the Commons, his friend Brad came up to him and said,
"Hey Alec, you might want to get your sister some downers."
Alec's heart rate picked up when he entered the Commons. The only voice he could really hear was Jessie's. It was the same torrential speech that he had heard in the car, and that could only mean one thing. She was running her mouth full auto to a group of girls leaning in at the same table, and they were getting the whole thing, from the climber on the barn wall to the strange sound that spooked her and her brother. Some of the girls began laughing scornfully at Jessie and making fun of her. Others were getting angry. How could she disrespect Emma like that? It's bad enough that the girl vanished. The situation didn't need to be revived just for being part of an elaborate attention stunt. Alec just hoped that nobody pieced together that they had been on somebody else's property. One of the counselors poked her head into Jessie's third-hour English. She got her attention and asked her to come into the hallway.
"Come see me after school?"
she asked.
"Just 15 minutes.
Jessie touched base with Alec to make time for the meeting. Great. Now everyone thought Jess was going cuckoo. And you know what? Maybe she was. The ticking of the clock in the counselor's tiny office was just a little too loud for Jessie. It sounded like it was leading up to something like a bomb. The two of them just stared at each other for a long moment.
"I hear that you feel you spotted Emma Warner."
Jess kept her eyes to the floor.
"Don't you want to talk about it?"
Me and my brother got our own car, and we drove a different way to school than normal. We drove by an old barn that we didn't know was there before, and I saw Emma in front of the barn.
"Did she look hurt?"
"No, not that I could tell."
"Did you go back?"
"We drove by several times while the road out of town was closed."
"Did you see her again?"
No.
"Then what happened?"
"I just wanted to see if we could spot her one last time. I mean, even if she wasn't real, I wanted to see whatever it was I was seeing as being her. So we drove by again, and we heard something terrible, okay? And it sounded like a lion's roar or a tiger's. I wasn't sure. And it sounded like someone was screaming. I started thinking that maybe Emma had been kidnapped and was being kept there, like maybe with others, and they were being fed to these big animals, and
Jess was losing her composure. The counselor's features were both sympathetic and stern. Her eyebrows were cinched, but her gaze was steady.
"I'm not going to judge, Miss Shepherd, but you do realize how this sounds."
Jessie looked down again.
"I think you might be experiencing some shade of PTSD from your loss of Emma, and I'll tell you that you are not alone. You're not the only student that has brought her up in the last few weeks."
"So you don't believe me?"
"Well, if Emma was being held for the purpose of being food for animals, I doubt you would have seen her out in the open, let alone climbing a wall so freely."
Jessie hung her head.
"Miss Shepherd, there's no shame in being overwhelmed. You're no dummy, but we are fragile creatures. Stress and sadness will do these things to a rational person over time."
"My brother's waiting for me."
Don't keep him waiting then. Remember, my door is always open.
Over the days that followed, Jess was quiet about her experiences at school, but at home, especially after Alec was in bed trying to sleep, she was at his bedside, staring at him until he would open his eyes and ask her what was wrong.
What's up, sis?
They have Emma. I know they do. Someone has her at that barn and is going to feed her to animals if they haven't already.
It was merely annoying the first few nights, but after the 5th night, Alec had enough, and he was all about some sort of plan of action.
So what do you want to do?
He hissed at her as she stood over his bed with wide and sleepless eyes.
We need to investigate,
she said. That was both the answer he expected and the last thing he thought he would hear.
Really, sis?
It would be the biggest local expose ever. I got the camera. We can find a way to be there long enough to find out what's going on and turn it all into the authorities. We'll be heroes, and we'll save innocent people that don't deserve to be eaten, like Emma.
Okay. For one thing, we are not storming somebody else's property with a video camera. Second, even if there really is a collection of big cats in that barn, how are we going to rescue anyone from them? Neither of us is allowed to just lift Dad's guns. Picking a fight with panthers calls for bullets.
We can't just sit back and do nothing.
She whisper-whined.
If I'm right, then my friend is in serious trouble along with who knows who else. The world has decided that they're all dead, and they might not be. They might be against something worse than death. And we're the only ones that have seen any signs of life out of that old place. If they're in there and they're in danger, then the clock is ticking. Tick-tock, you know?
Alex slid his jaw to the side in thought.
We'll either have to do it on the way to school or the way back. We can't let anyone know what we're up to. We'll have to come up with a cover story to explain why we're either late for school or late coming home.
And that was the first time Alec had seen something like relief in his sister's eyes for days. They decided that they would investigate early in the morning, when people and animals would most likely be asleep. Alec phoned the school, stating that they could be a few minutes late on account of vehicle issues. The school didn't question it. They made the bold move of leaving for school 20 minutes early. Nobody at home questioned it. The universe had officially sanctioned this investigation. It was a dismal morning. A spectral sheet of fog engulfed the landscape in a world of short-sightedness that was revealed a few feet at a time. It scared Jesse. Alec thought that it was perfect from a tactical standpoint. They found the barn despite the feeling of being lost, and, just like that, they turned on to the barn's gravel path for the first time. They could see the roof hovering over the world above the fog. The untended grass was even taller up close, and it drifted out of the fog like seaweed in murky water. The barn emerged, a shipwreck haunted by birds instead of fish. The path curved around the barn, taking the twins to the opposite side of the building. Here was quite an expanse of gravel, hemmed in by a tide of tall grass. Alec was the first one to feel it. The sensation that they weren't alone. A luminous flickering created an orange ghost in the fog. The twins got out of the car and approached. They found a burning barrel.
There's someone here, Jess. We have to leave.
We just got here,
she said, and she stepped back from the barrel as soon as she had peered in. Alec came over to look. Among the rubbish in the barrel, blackened with red, pulsating embers, were several bones. Large bones. There were fragments of ribs in the mix, The sight of them made Alec uncomfortable.
Oh my god!
Oh my god. Alec, are those people's bones? Oh god, I can't. Who would do that? Who would do that?
There was a flash and the recorded sound of a camera.
No.
Jessie was taking pictures with her phone. She cursed to herself when she realized she hadn't silenced the sound effect.
Jess!
Merritt, the sound's off now. Please.
She said. They stalked toward the barn, which cast a shadow through the fog, making it seem even darker and gloomier than it actually was. Jess held her phone up with shaking hands, a blinking red light indicating that she was recording. Alec was completely dialed into his tactical senses. He couldn't see much, but he didn't see anything that indicated the presence of hostages or zoo exhibits. He was waiting for a hidden camera to give itself away with a blinking red light, but there was nothing. Sounds? There was the crackling of the barrel behind them, a gentle sound. The breeze teased his ears. A high humming sound appeared. He almost thought it was human until the breeze relented enough that he could hear that it was flies. A few clouds of flies churned hither and yon, and they filled the air with their dissonant song. And then there was another hum, but he felt it before he heard it. It was a vibration in the ground itself that became a subsonic rumble, like distant thunder. It made Jessie freeze in her tracks. The twins looked at each other. The sound swelled again. There was a third sound. Speech. The staccato whispering of a single voice that repeated the same thing over and over again in a harsh whisper.
It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit.
The twins neared another congregation of flies, but it seemed that they flocked around something solid and tall. The sun filtered through the fog to give the figure a rusty red color, as its skinless muscles flexed and twisted with its furious activity. It was stitching something to its own body. The needle was a shard of bone. Patches of loose skin that had clearly belonged to someone else hung around the creature's flailing torso and arms as it tried to make it part of its own body, and it just wasn't working.
It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit.
The creature wasn't human. The ill-gotten skin was. It snapped its head in the direction of the twins, and it froze along with them. The gelatinous black eyes had a gloss to them that shifted, telling Alec that it was looking them over. The twins decided to run. The thing decided to chase. No sooner had Jess's door shut than Alec had fumbled the keys into the ignition and put the car in reverse and turned in a half arc. Just as he threw the car into drive, the skinless thing threw itself against Jesse's passenger window. Blood and saliva and other things rained on the glass as the creature began barking. Its sunken black eyes were wide with the universal language of madness. Its unnaturally low voice rattled the bones of the twins, but the same throat overlaid its bellow with a shrill squeal that could rend eardrums. Alec recognized the sound right away as he felt his own jaw rattling. He peeled out of there, flinging gravel every which way. The creature's echoing bark becoming speech.
Fat.
The next day, both of the Shepherd twins looked like ghosts that had seen a ghost. They didn't have much to say to each other, or anyone else, for several days. As usual, Alec was the first to shrug off the shock and don a mask of normalcy. Just in time for their mother to ask about what was bothering the two of them. He explained it away as stress over school.
We could have dreamed it, couldn't we?
Jessie said as she stood in her brother's bedroom, gazing out the window. He sat on his bed, glued to his phone.
Mm-hmm.
It was foggy outside and our senses were heightened. We were expecting to see something.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, Alec. I've been having really bad dreams. I want this whole thing to just be a bad dream. I mean, aren't you being affected by this at all?
Alec didn't respond. Then Jessie added,
Did you get any good footage?
I got pictures of everything. But the thing.
Alec held up his phone. He showed her a series of pictures taken from the driver's seat of the car. Jess was caught in poses that would be comical in any other context. The window was a blur with a face that couldn't quite be made out, complete with the silhouettes of clawed hands that were also blurred from frenzied movement.
You actually got it,
she said in a small voice.
They aren't good shots.
Yeah, but you actually got it, for real.
Jessie touched her face with trembling hands, and then took his phone to look at it more closely. There was something about Jessie's reaction to the photos that made Alec want to delete them. Seeing the creature had shaken up both of them, but she was already shaken up before. In the morning, Alec got up before anyone else and he deleted the photos. No big loss. They could have been faked by anyone with a Halloween mask. They didn't prove the existence of any strange monster or the cause of the disappearance of any lost friends. Alec walked into the school lunch commons to hear Jessie's voice once again babbling, but this time it was high with tensions, and it was joined by a gaggle of other voices. Nobody was laughing at her this time. They were all mad. One of the girls surrounding Jessie took her phone from her and dashed it to the floor, cracking the screen. Their parents were called to the school for an emergency meeting. Alec stood outside the door to the counselor's office, leaning against the wall, bouncing his shoulders off of it. The first to come out were his parents, both wearing expressions of concern. Next came Jessie, with flushed cheeks.
We'll see you when you get home,
his mom said as she touched his forearm and kept going, leaving Alec alone with Jessie in the hallway.
You transferred the photos from my phone, didn't you?
He said. The way she looked at the floor said enough.
It was the closest thing I had to evidence.
Yeah, of what?
What we had seen and heard, and maybe of what happened to Emma.
Alec folded his arms and turned away to roll his eyes.
So, what did they say?
That I imagined all of it, and that I need help.
Yeah, well, maybe they're right. Let's go,
he said.
You can't say that. You were there too. You saw and heard the same things I did.
He reached out to take her arm, but she shrank away.
How do you know that wasn't Emma's skin that it was putting on?
Jessie! Come on!
Jessie wouldn't come on. She took off down the school corridor faster than Alec cared to chase. He felt the last layer of his patience eroding, a process that had been in the works for weeks. You know what they say happens when the guy that never snaps finally does. He stepped outside to cool off. It didn't take him long, about 10 minutes. He began pacing the parking lot and glancing at the school doors on each pass. Jessie was still in there. He got out his phone to text her.
Okay, sis, we really need to get out of here.
Another defiant 5 minutes passed.
I know you're mad, but let's go home and get this day behind us, okay?
His phone dinged 2 minutes later.
It hurts, Alec.
I know it does. Let's get home. We'll feel better when we're all home.
It hurts because it doesn't fit.
Alec's forehead wrinkled for half a second before the adrenaline hit him. He called her phone. No answer. He called again. She answered.
Jesse. Hello? Can you hear me?
A low, rumbling sound like an amplified purr filled his ear. Then the call dropped. He nearly tore the door off its hinges when he stormed back into the school. One of the teachers spotted him.
Young man, we'll be locking the doors soon and you'll need to be off the premises. Young man! Young man!
The teacher faded away as Alec marched past. He held up his phone and continually redialed Jesse's number. The teacher followed him from a distance while shouting,
Young man, you come back here right now! Young man, can you hear me? Get back here!
Shut up!
Alec mouthed to himself.
Shut up,
That's when he heard it. His sister's music box ringtone, muffled and distant. One last redial, and he followed the hollow sound to the ladies' room. There was the sound of a crash just before he burst into the bathroom to find the phone sitting on the grate in the center of the floor. Streaks of blood led away from it and up and across the walls and out a shattered window. Alec tumbled to his knees. The looks that the school counselor had given to Jesse were then given to Alec as he rose to validate his sister's story. Suddenly, he was just as adamant as she had been that there was a skin-thieving alien on the loose. Alec had no appetite for drama, so explaining his behavior rationally was impossible. It hit the news that the kidnapper was still at large, and that whoever was rotting in prison must have been the wrong man. Was this how Jessie felt when she was trying to tell Alec and her parents and her peers and everyone that she saw something out there that couldn't be explained? Alone? Isolated by 100% of the people in her world? Authorities were looking for Jessie for several weeks. Then they transitioned to just looking for a body. A body that wouldn't turn up, like all the others hadn't. The funeral was abysmal, without any remains to lay to rest. Life went on with a limp. Alec lay awake in bed. Nothing unusual for him. He had spent every single day since his sister's disappearance thinking about her. His other half. His wild, untamed counterpart. He knew she was dead. He just knew. If she were still out there somewhere, he would be able to feel it. The distance he felt inside of himself was a sanity-crushing ache. A breeze stirred him from the uneasy sleep that had overtaken him. The curtains around his open window billowed and swayed. He liked sleeping with the window open, and would do so until it was simply too cold for it. He was about to slip back under the tide of sleep when a voice drifted inside.
Alec.
Sleep fled him, replaced by a strange sort of anxiety. The name was on his lips before it was in his thoughts.
Jesse?
He was at the window in an instant. Nobody answered him, and no one confronted him. He threw on some clothes and went outside. It was a full moon, and it was directly overhead with no shadows to cast. There was still nobody. That is, until he turned to go back inside. A familiar shape blocked the door. It stepped forward, and the face of his sister was revealed. But it wasn't her eyes in those dark sockets that were boiling with black madness. She said it with a smooth voice that trailed into a deep purr. She slowly came toward him, allowing him to see that her shape was all wrong. Like the body underneath wasn't made for the skin.
It hurts because that doesn't fit.
Real hunger can't be fed. Written by H.K. Reyes. Narrated by Andrea Rose. Time to go soon. But before I do, I want to tell you all about my cowboy. The man who took me into the forever night. The man who made me hungry and then left me to starve. Listen close, I want to tell you about the man I love. I grew up a preacher's daughter. Daddy thundered fire and brimstone from the pulpit on Sunday. Repent or be damned, and hillbillies would shout and quiver. At night he pulled down my jammies and sweat over me, whispering the word of God in my ear. He'd take the belt to me after.
Temptation is a sin, child. Only like yours will lead the righteous astray.
Mama was soft and kind, with slate gray eyes and a voice like a sparrow's song. Her makeup was caked thick to hide the purple on her cheekbones. Let's run away, I said. Run as far as we can and be free. She pat my head and dried my tears and told me, ain't nowhere to run, baby. It's the same all over. This is the way life is. Be a good girl, and we'll find our reward in the other place. I didn't like it when Daddy spat hellfire, but I liked to hear Mama talk about the other place. In my dreams, it was orange and pink. A desert sunrise surging like wildfire beyond the mountains. In my dreams, I felt the sky in the folds of my heart, and I was free. I ran one night past brush and prairie dog holes with Daddy's voice on the chase.
You get back here, devil girl, or I'll whip you silly.
But I was fast and small and hard to find in the dark. I crouched low behind an old mesquite. Teardrops making polka dots in the silver sand. I clasped my hands and whispered a prayer. Please, if you're out there, help me. Show me a way out. I heard something. The sound of a hunter picking meat off his kill. Lead chewing and slurping and something scraping the ground. I followed the sound and found a circle of rocks like a heathen church. Something in the middle bobbing up and down. Something else twitching and moaning. I hugged close to a big rock and peeked my head around the side. I saw a man. A skinny cowboy in faded denim and snakeskin boots. His skin so pale it looked like blue jelly. He crouched and licked at the neck of another shaking on the ground. The other's eyes were wide and rolling, his quivering fish mouth sucking the air. Cowboy's head shot up, and he sniffed. Streaks of red oozed down his mouth. Slow as molasses, his head jerked around, and his eyes found mine. Black eyes, vulture eyes, eyes that held the night itself, eyes that could wrap you up and squeeze you soft or tight. He smirked, and stringy pieces of red shook as he talked.
Ain't your mom ever teach you not to stare?
I know what you are. Bloodsucker, right? I seen the movies.
Get your head out of the clouds, girl. Me and my buddy are just having a talk.
Make me like you, I said. Cowboy laughed.
You wanna be like me. Sucking on dead meat in the dark like a mangy old dog.
I am a dog with its leg in a trap. And I want you to chew it off. My mama says this is just how it is, but I'm gonna run and look for somewhere different.
Your mama's a smart woman. You wanna kill. Ain't no one wanna be like me unless they got someone to kill.
My daddy?
It's always the daddies. Listen up, girl. This life ain't no fairy tale. It's a death rattle before every meal. It's railroad spike hunger, so sharp you can't think of nothing else. It's a forever night, with no more sunrises. No more to the last one. The one that'll light you up like the 4th of July.
I told you I seen the movies.
Then you seen the endings. It's a bad luck life and you'd be stupid to pick it.
I stepped out from behind the rock and stared hard into those marble eyes. I pulled my dress up over my head and dropped it into the sand. Naked and shaken, I walked toward him. I brushed my hair from my neck and said, I might be stupid, but I know what I want. Sink your teeth into me, cowboy. Find the red life inside me and make it your own. He stood up and circled me, his frozen eyes chilling me wherever they looked.
Dummy.
He said at last.
You want to run from the sun. I won't tell you no. Get ready. It hurts.
He pulled me close and snuffed at my neck. Cold nose and cold breath. My heart pumping like it was out of time. His mouth opened, and he breathed white froth. Lockjaw bite sunk into my flesh, and razor wire scraped my veins. My skin screamed and my insides swelled thick with tar. I dropped down into the dirt.
It takes a minute to get used to it.
He said. No, go.
Sorry, honey. I ramble solo. Eat soon, or it'll make you crazy. Adios.
He was gone. The world was gone. I was falling or floating in cavernous dark, nothing above or below. Heavy footsteps pulled me back from eternity. I opened my mouth and gurgled. Come back to me, cowboy. Come back. Daddy looked down at me and cracked his swollen knuckle.
I think it's high time I taught you something about humility,
He said. Iron hands dragged me back to the yard and lifted me onto a splintery workbench.
I'm a patient man, child. But we can't have you running off like that no more.
He lifted a crowbar and set it down gently to kiss my kneecap. His eyes were ablaze with white fire.
The word of the Lord shall light the holy path,
He said, raising the crowbar high.
and the wicked shall cower under the sword of judgment.
A cackle from the shadows.
A preacher man, huh? I never had much use for the word.
Daddy spun around.
Who in the hell's that? I'm the sin you ain't got the balls to commit.
Cowboy stepped forward, the moon making a halo around his oil-spill hair.
Let her alone,
He said. Daddy laughed.
Who's gonna make me? Skinny boy like you? Come here, son, and I'll put the fear of God into you.
Daddy swung the crowbar, and Cowboy caught it. Daddy's arm snapped, and slick white bone popped through the skin. He fell screaming. Cowboy drove the crowbar deep into his gut. A fence post pinning him to the ground.
Skinny boys are hard to kill, old man. And I'm as skinny as they come. Go ahead, girl. You must be feeling it by now.
I was. My belly hissed and clawed like a raccoon in a cage. I rolled off the table and crawled on all fours, Daddy squealing and shouting, but the sound was distant and small. I heard one thing and one thing only, the warm heartbeat calling me with its low rhythm. I clamped my teeth hard into his neck. Sweet juice spurted and dribbled down my chin like a ripe tangerine. It pumped into my mouth and filled me until I shuddered inside. Daddy was maggot white and stammering.
Please. Please.
I ran sticky red hands through his hair. Daddy, it's okay. I'm gonna teach you something about humility, I said. I stuck my fingers into the hole in his neck and pulled until the meat split apart. His scream went high like a cicada whine. Bones snap at a candied rhythm, flesh and fat squishing in my hands. The final skin ribbon snapped in his neck. Just like that, he was leftovers. I threw his head into the brush and sucked his jugular dry like a milkshake straw. I looked up. With my belly filled with the soul of another, I could see colors I didn't have names for. I heard crickets landing on blades of grass and smelled the powder on wings of moths. I felt the neon net for the first time. And I looked at my cowboy. A blue denim dream with see-through skin. I looked at him, and I knew I'd follow him to the end.
You ain't never forget your first.
he said. I showed him a red smile that dropped when I heard the screams. Mama was in the yard yelling, "Charles! Charles!" and staring at Daddy's big blue hands. She looked at me. "Monster!" she yelled through choking sobs. "No, Mama, wait." But Cowboy's hand held my shoulder.
She's right,
He said.
You ain't got no mama now. Our kind don't make friends with the food. Run, girl, and find the place you're looking for.
I'm coming with you.
The hell you are. I got enough shit to shovel without babysitting, too.
I didn't ask no questions. The world was small before I met you. Now it's big enough to swallow me up. And I want to see it all.
While you ramble, I ramble as long as it takes.
God damn, girl. You're like a toothache that won't go away. Well, if you're coming, then come. Sun's hot on our heels, and if we don't keep moving, he's gonna catch us in the open.
I stuck close to his side, and we ran. When the sun went down, we'd stalk the hills, hunting for bony ranch hands and oily teenagers. My ears were sharper than his, and I could hear the river rush in their veins a mile off. I'd wrap myself in a velvet shadow and wait for my meal to walk by. He taught me how to hit them with a kill strike to make it quick, how to crush their windpipe so they wouldn't scream, how to make it look like a cougar attack. Every meal was a sticky poem, sweet as strawberry jam when I licked between my fingers. During the day, we'd lay low in a cave or an old trailer, and he'd tell me stories as I floated into dreams. He called me his toothache. He didn't talk much about his life before the bite. There'd been a wife and a daughter, but they were long gone. I asked what happened to them once, and his dark eyes looked away.
You never forget your first,
he said, and I didn't ask again. One night, we found a couple hikers wrapped up in their sleeping bags. His didn't even wake up, and mine was feisty. He was fighting and flailing and flopping slowly as I sucked out the juice. Finally, she just held my back and breathed slow. I looked in her half-closed eyes. She knew it was all right, and the end wasn't really so scary. I kissed her soft, and left a red stain on her lip. Shh. Just relax, hon. Relax and let go. You're going to the other place, I said. Her eyes went cloudy, and she drifted away. Cowboy scoffed.
Other place. Grow up, toothache. Ain't no place but here.
You're a grumpy old dog sometimes. How do you know what comes after?
I've been on the hunt long enough to know that the only difference between live meat and dead meat is a few twitches and grunts.
Think what you want. I've seen the other place in my dreams, and we're going there when it's over. He laughed.
Sunday school was a long time ago, kid. If there is another place, you and I ain't gonna see it. We're burning for what we done.
Eating ain't a sin. We're gonna be free and happy, and you'll thank me when we get there.
Kid,
He said with narrow eyes.
if you can point to one thing, One real goddamn thing that'll show me there's something else in the sky. I will drop to my knees and sing hallelujah right here.
I was quiet for a bit. I prayed that night. I said, I prayed for a way out, and there you were. Make fun all you want, but I see the other place when I look at you. Maybe I ain't got proof, but I got hope. I hope there's orange and gold at the end of this night. A place where all hurts are soothed, and bright light fills us until we are the sun. And I hope we go there together. You and me. Together with no end.
Why in the hell do you want that?
And I was gonna say the word, but he gave me a look that stopped me cold. I held the word in my mind instead, so he could read it behind my eyes. We made a camp in an old bear den just before the watercolor dawn. He held me close, closer than he ever had. No stories that day, just his arm on my waist and his breath in my hair.
You've got a sunrise in your heart,
He said as I closed my eyes. I woke at dusk and reached out for him. I found a note.
Been fun, toothache, but the lonely road is calling. Don't bother looking for me. If this life teach you one thing, it's how to stay hid. Adios.
I was shaking. So Mama was right. This is the way life is. I ran into the Rocky Hills. I found some city folk roughing it in an RV and I tore them into chunks. The red spilled into the sand and I didn't drink a drop. I could smell them in their veins. It's been days. He told me the hunger would make me crazy, but I don't feel a thing. There's another hunger eating away at me, turning me to dust from the inside out. The note was a lie, too. He said he rambles solo, but that ain't the truth. The truth was in his eyes that night when I almost said the word. Cowboy didn't fear nothing except that word. He was afraid I'd try to say it again. He wouldn't be able to stop me. He was afraid I'd say it, and it'd drop him dead quicker than a stake to the heart. Maybe he was right. I've made up my mind. After I set this down, I'm going to take a walk into the cool blue desert. I'm going to find a nice place to sit and watch. The yellow streaks over the mountains will burn my tears away, and I'll be carried off on a flare of light like a dream upon waking. If this world is the same all over, maybe it's different in the next. There's a sunrise in my heart, and I'm dying to dig it out. But if my cowboy ever sniffs you out in the dark and spills your neck juice down his chin, tell him something with your last breath, will you? Tell him if there is another place, I'll be waiting there on the day when the sun catches up to him. Tell him if there's not, then my ashes will ride the desert wind and search for him in the night. Tell him real hunger only gets worse the more you feed it. And I have been starving from the moment we met. And if he don't give you time for all that, just tell him one thing for me, will you? Tell him I loved him, please. Tell him I loved him.
Gillian. Written by Kris Mallory. Performed by Jesse Cornett. Featuring Joseph Gable, Alicia Pavlis, and Sarianna Gregg. Audio production by Jesse Cornett. Music by Brandon Boone.
Liquid death boiled as the candle flame scorched the bottom of a silver spoon. Using a hypodermic needle, the alchemist loaded the poisonous brew into a syringe, leaving the impurities caught in a tiny ball of cotton. A black sweatshirt hung loosely off his body like a robe, the hood casting his sallow face in shadow. He twirled the needle in a bony hand, then poised the sharp tip over the track-marked arm of his most loyal customer. Jackson bit down on the end of the tourniquet tied around his bicep and pulled it tight. Like magic, the outline of thick veins protruded at the crook of his arm, each bulge scarred from abuse and infection. He nodded to the alchemist, and the needle penetrated his skin. Taking in a sharp breath, his jaw released the band, and the familiar burn began its journey. A soft moan reminded him that Gillian sat beside him. She reached out and stroked his shaved head, a syringe still stuck in her flesh, dangling like jewelry. Jackson turned to embrace her, but the first wave of the drug hit hard and sudden. A tsunami of pleasure swept him into the waiting arms of oblivion. The drug-induced dream played like a movie. Scenes flashed by as Jackson floated above himself, a mere spectator to the glimmer of nightmarish events. Gillian was on top of him. She kissed his neck and tore at his clothing. Her body gyrated and thrusted, while the alchemist and several other afflicted souls sat around the drug house. The dead-eyed fiends groped at the two lovers, drool stretching from scab-covered lips. They walked together through the warm summer night, peering into parked vehicles as they went. Gillian stopped. She placed her finger to his lips. The wind blew back her long auburn hair, revealing a mischievous grin as she threw a stone through the side window of a caravan. Jackson dove in, slicing his already scarred arms on the shattered glass. He rifled through the center console. Then, Gillian tugged at his waist, cursing.
Shit! What the fuck? Shit, come on.
The car alarm had sent a man rushing like a minotaur from a nearby townhome. Jackson tried to brandish his weapon as a warning, though he had reacted too slowly. A fist landed a crushing blow against his face, knocking him aside.
What do you think you're going, you bitch?
Gillian turned to run, but the man caught her by the dress, ripping it as he pulled her closer. His hands wrapped around her neck.
Come here, bitch.
Her complexion turned purple, tongue protruding from her gaping, soundless mouth. She clawed at the hands killing her. Knife in hand, Jackson rushed the man from behind. The spotlight of a circling helicopter swept the streets and alleys as sirens drew nearer. Out of breath, Jackson and Gillian ran into the front yard of a small cottage, his great-grandmother's house. He hid behind the bushes below a bedroom window. Sweat poured down his face as he used a blood-covered blade to pry out a familiar pane of glass. As a teenager, he had done that very same thing 100 times. Nana had forbidden him to see Gillian, so sneaking out was the only way they could spend time together. Red and blue lights illuminated the block as a police cruiser turned the corner. Gillian ducked behind Nana's thick lilacs. Jackson took a chance and climbed up the stucco. He tumbled through the window into his childhood bedroom. Then, he quickly reached down and took Gillian's hand, pulling her up the wall just as the spotlight from the cruiser scanned the house. They held their breath. Jackson wondered what prison would be like. He imagined officers kicking down his great-grandmother's door, guns drawn. They would rip Gillian from his arms and carry him away in cuffs. The blood on his hands was proof enough. Jackson couldn't handle the thought of never seeing Gillian again. Maybe the cops would shoot them both dead. At least then they would still be together. The purr of the engine faded as the police continued their search. Gillian let out a relieved sigh, and Jackson pulled her close, breathing in her scent. His heart rate slowed as the high tapered.
As long as she is mine, everything will be all right,
he thought. He found comfort in the sound of her steady breathing and slipped into the waiting darkness. Though he slept, part of him felt Gillian's warmth fade in the night. Shortly thereafter, the screaming began. Jackson was startled from a bad dream by Gillian kicking him in the ribs.
Stop.
In the nightmare, Nana had been calling for him. And though he'd wanted to go to her, his body had refused to obey.
Jack, get up.
Gillian kicked him again. He swatted her away, wanting to slip back to sleep, but his arms were too weak to defend.
Jack.
He mumbled.
Let me be.
Jack, get up. We have to go. We're in real trouble, baby.
I'm tired.
Voice trembling, Gillian said,
This is bad. This is really, really bad.
Lifting his head from the floor, a sliver of sunlight shining through the crack in the curtains triggered an unbearable pounding in Jackson's skull. The left side of his face stung from temple to chin. His entire body throbbed. Worse, the sickness churned the rotting contents of his stomach. He needed a bump more than he had ever needed anything in his life. Confused, he glanced around the room at various baseball trophies and first-place blue ribbons, all of which had his name inscribed in gold leaf. His eyes went wide.
How did we get to Nana's?
Gillian sighed and fell backwards on the bed like a rag doll. She shook her head. Flashes from the previous night came crashing back.
No.
Jackson thought, noticing the dried red stains on his hands.
Jill, you all right?
He rolled onto his knees and brushed her hair from her pale face. Voice barely audible, she said,
Dead.
It was self-defense. That guy was going to kill you.
Jackson thought about the beast that had attacked them. He strained to remember what happened, but a thick fog covered his memories. All he recalled was slashing and stabbing like a madman, doing everything in his power to protect Gillian.
Besides,
he added,
we don't know for sure that he's dead.
Not him.
Gillian said, her eyes dark and unsettling.
While you slept, I killed the thing pretending to be your grandmother.
Jackson swallowed hard.
What?
Gillian stared at him. The weight of her words felt too real, too dark, to be a ruse. Nana couldn't hear very well. She wouldn't have known someone had broken into the house unless one of them had left the room during the night. Gillian's hands trembled, and her blue sundress was damp with sweat and blood.
Show me,
he said, doing his best to hold back the sickness screaming, to be free of his throat.
We should leave, baby.
We will, but first I need to see for myself. I hope you just had a nightmare too.
Gillian nodded. She stood and led him from the safety of his childhood treasures. Splintered wood, what was left of the coffee table, was strewn about the living room. The sofa and recliners were overturned. The old television had been smashed, a phantom image still rolling underneath the static. The entire room, even the ceiling, was speckled red.
I saw her for what she was. I used your knife, but she didn't die easily,
Gillian said. In a state of shocked disbelief, Jackson ignored her and followed a trail of gore to the basement door. The steps descended into pitch black. He tried the light switch, clicking it off and on, but the darkness simply laughed at him. A ghostly cry echoed from the grim depths.
Help, Nana. Jackie, help me.
Jackson blinked at the reaching shadows.
What do you mean she didn't die easily? Jill, what did you do?
Nana's voice wasn't real. Hallucinations were common with his mix of narcotics, but this all felt different. Like a fading dream trying to come back. He pinched himself hard enough to prove he wasn't still dreaming. Gillian crept up behind him with a flashlight and shined it down the stairwell.
Look,
she said. At the bottom, a chalky white foot with long yellow nails rested in a pool of congealed blood. Jackson thought he saw the dead toes twitch. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light.
You've seen them, Jack,
Gillian said.
When death courses through your veins, the truth becomes clear. But she was different. Something was wrong with her. It wasn't your grandmother.
The hair raised on his arms. Jackson couldn't deny that he knew what she meant. Sometimes people are more than they appear. A picture of the alchemist formed in his mind. He shook the thought away, then slowly descended the creaking stairs. Nothing in his life as a degenerate drug addict had prepared him for the carnage in the basement.
Oh, Christ,
he said. The woman who had raised him lay desecrated in a pool of black gel. The skin of her arms and legs had been sliced open, exposing the muscle and tendons beneath. She had been scalped. The white of the skull perfectly matched the white of her rolled back eyes. Her neck had been slashed open, and her tongue had been pulled through the wound in a grotesquely comical manner.
She didn't die easily, Gillian? You fucking flayed her!
A monster wore her skin, I swear. Baby, let's take the rest of the jewelry and go. No one knows we were here.
Gillian dangled a necklace in front of the flashlight. Clasped to the thin silver chain was a heart-shaped pendant, adorned with a translucent black diamond. The light refracting through the gemstone created nightmarish shadow creatures that danced along the walls of the stairway.
And keeping this one,
she continued.
It's special.
You can pawn the rest.
She turned away, leaving Jackson alone in the dark.
I'm sorry, Nana. Gillian didn't mean to hurt you. It was the dope.
He cried to the dissected corpse.
Please forgive us.
Eyes adjusting to the darkness, Jackson stared at the mangled body. Her wrinkled face reminded him that she had lived a long life. He wasn't sure how old Nana had been, certainly over 90. Maybe over 100. He remembered the day they'd met. Jackson was 7, and Nana had stood next to him at his mother's freshly dug grave. Even then, she had seemed ancient.
You shall come live with me, Jackie.
She had said.
I raised your mother and your mother's mother. I taught them to take proper care of their bodies. But silly children always refused to listen.
Tears welled at the edge of her eyes, but her voice grew furious.
Opium. A ridiculous way to die. Things will be different this time. Yes, very different. Now come along, child.
Nana had grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the casket. She had worn that heart-shaped diamond pendant. In fact, he had never seen her without it around her neck. Now, her neck was practically gone. Nana deserved better. But what could be done? She was dead, and he believed it was all his fault.
I'm sorry.
Jackson turned away and raced up the stairs after Gillian. Room by room, they tore through bookshelves and drawers looking for anything of value. Jackson found a revolver under Nana's mattress. He flicked open the cylinder. It was loaded. After slapping it closed again, he stuffed it into his jeans. Gillian emptied the jewelry boxes into a duffel bag. It would be enough to keep them high for a very, very long time.
Will it be enough to make us forget what we've done?
Jackson wondered.
One more thing. Then we can go.
Gillian said, walking into the kitchen. Jackson followed. After extinguishing the stove's pilot light, she turned on all the burners. The rancid smell of natural gas quickly drove them from the house. Gillian sought refuge at the only place they were welcome. The alchemist allowed them to hide out in the condemned house and kept them supplied with as many drugs as they could handle, providing they forked over cash, of course. Jackson pawned all the stolen goods, save for the necklace and gun. Money wasn't a problem, but the explosion in the suburbs was all over the news.
Now, here's Brock Sanders with Evening News. Good evening, I am Brock Sanders. A large explosion today rocked the southwest block of the Fremont Avenue area. Arson is suspected. There was significant damage to adjacent houses. Authorities are investigating, but no suspects have been arrested.
To his relief, the newscasters made no mention of the mutilated old woman the police had surely found in the basement. He hoped the whole thing would be forgotten in a few days. The alchemist claimed the police had listed Jackson as a person of interest, that his face was plastered on flyers stapled to telephone poles around the city. Worried one of their friends would give them up.
Jill, you're not fucking thinking. We're not safe here. The police are either going to come looking, or worse, these people are going to give us up. How can you trust them?
Jackson begged Gillian to skip town. Perhaps find a place to hide in the forest.
I don't know where we'll go. We can go hide in the woods, or we'll get on a train, and we'll just ride it.
Pressing another needle into her arm, she said,
Where'd we go, baby? We don't know how to survive outside of the city. Besides, we've got to be close to our medicine. This is the best place for us. Unless the cops tack on a reward, we'll be safe here.
She nodded out before Jackson could protest. Safe wasn't a term he would use to describe the den of horrors in which they were trapped. Addicts came and went all hours of the night, most too strung out to know what was going on, yet still capable of spilling someone's guts if it meant them securing another fix. The alchemist couldn't be trusted either. Jackson had caught him greedily eyeing the necklace that Gillian refused to take off. Gillian was the worst of them all. She was different somehow, completely despondent most of the time. After spiking a vein, she would sit on the floor staring at the rats crawling around the discarded containers of rotten food, while other beasts with beady red eyes stared back from the holes in the walls. For hours, she mumbled to herself, slowly rocking back and forth.
You can see what happens. You don't see. It's in front of me, and I can feel everything that is going through my body, and I know.
Jackson wanted to escape the trauma of that night, but not through the needle. Dope was like quicksand, though, and Gillian seemed as if she preferred to sink. He tried to keep his head clear and discovered how difficult it was to fight the sickness. He might have found the strength if not for Gillian tempting him back to the dark side. When Jackson was coherent, Gillian acted as if he were invisible. He hated it, but he realized she was lost in the real world. They could only be together in that fantasy realm where consequences never matter, and Nana wasn't dead. So once again he rolled up his sleeve and accepted the alchemist's terms of surrender. Stoned out of their minds, they sat next to each other on a stained mattress in the graffiti-covered bedroom. The lock didn't work and junkies would stumble in from time to time. Jackson had to fight them off, threatening them with his knife or pistol.
You so much as fucking touch her, you're dead. Take one more fucking step and I will blow a goddamn hole in your head. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out right now.
During the night, the bravest pressed their luck. They crept in, hungry for a piece of Gillian, only to retreat when she attacked them like a rabid wolf. She was always ready, happy to rip flesh from bone. After each attempted assault, she seemed more alive, more like her old self. Then the needle would come out again and she would regress, back to mindless mumbling, the siren-like chant forcing Jackson to join her.
I need to feel this. Stop. No.
Drinking condensed soup directly from cans and sipping brown water from the bathroom sink barely kept their bodies alive. It seemed that every day Jackson poked a new hole into his belt. As for the drugs, Jackson had reached his peak. He worried the next shot might be his last, and only took enough to keep the sickness at bay. Gillian, however, refused to slow down. Spurred on by the violence of ripping another addict's face to shreds, she pulled the syringe from her purse, then loaded the biggest fix that he had ever seen. Jackson wanted to stop her, but the alchemist had already injected a dose of death into his arm.
Don't,
he uttered. Gillian grinned.
Nana told me to do it.
Nana,
Jackson thought. He had loved her so much, She had been his family once. Consciousness dimming, he watched the massive hit flow into Gillian's ravaged vein, and then the darkness took him. The next morning, he found her lying in the tub, puke dripping from her chin, bugs crawling over her body. He swept the roaches off her cold flesh, picked her up by the arms, then dragged her back into the bedroom.
Come on, wake up, Gillian!
Jackson draped her arm over his shoulder and held most of her weight.
Gillian, come on!
He tried to get her to walk around the room.
Gillian, wake up!
He slapped her face.
Come on, you have to move!
Let me feel. No, I can't.
She protested, but Jackson wouldn't relent until she was mostly taking steps on her own.
You almost died!
She laughed.
So?
After that, the days and nights blurred together. Regardless of the way Jackson struggled to curb her use, Gillian kept injecting herself with ever-increasing amounts. During the day, he watched her closely, making sure she stayed away from the alchemist. Eventually, he needed to get himself right. Then, while he was too high to stop her, she purposely overdosed once more. Again and again, Jackson revived her. Gillian's temperature never was as warm as it should have been, and her complexion never changed back from the sickly gray color. He hadn't witnessed anything like it before. No matter what he tried, her usage increased, and so did her madness. What had begun as drug-fueled mumblings had turned into full-blown rants.
Her face, they were piercing through me. You need to understand that there are monsters like this out there, and they are trying to take what's ours.
During her worst bouts, Gillian raved to the junkies about Jackson's dead great-grandmother.
She was not a grandmother. She was not a grandmother. She was evil.
They listened to her preach, nodding along in agreement when she claimed that a wraith haunted her, that the old woman never left her side, no matter how deep she stuck the needle.
She was following me. She's still here. She's still here. She still haunts me and she talks to me and I can't get rid of her. That wraith, that monster, she haunts me. No matter how deep I let the needle
Jackson
sink
had
in,
enough.
she's still here.
Using a roll of duct tape, he tied her up, binding her hands behind her back. It was the only way he knew to protect her. The intervention didn't work. After he had fallen asleep, she broke free and purchased more dope. The alchemist was always happy to oblige a paying customer. Distraught, Jackson finally gave up.
She needs to hit rock bottom. Then she'll let me save her,
he thought. Though he despised himself, he refused to interfere with Gillian's downfall any longer. He turned away from her pain, like every junkie turns away from his or her own suffering. Even when the infection set in and the wounds on her arms festered, he remained silent. Even when bone and tendons were exposed, maggots biting at the dead skin, he kept himself on the outskirts of her insanity. Still, she refused to stop, shooting up whenever she could. All the while, she rubbed at the gem around her neck and swore Nana was a monster.
A monster, she haunts me.
When the money dried up, the alchemist's goodwill disappeared. Gillian refused to trade him the heart-shaped necklace.
You can't have this. This is mine. It's mine. You can't have.
And they were forced back onto the streets.
I need more. Jack, you don't understand. I need more. I need more.
She pounded her fists into his chest.
You promised. You promised you would take care of me.
Gillian's plea finally broke him.
How?
He screamed, ashamed.
You won't let me!
Find a way.
Without any other options, Jackson suggested that they fall back on the oldest hustle in history, until he could find a more permanent solution to their problems. Gillian agreed. She promised him no matter what happened, this time would be the last time. Jackson knew it was a promise that wouldn't be kept, but lying to himself had always been so much easier than accepting the truth. Jackson sat at the bar staring at a reflection he resented. A machine pumped smoke that swept across the neon-lit floor. Crumpled dollar bills littered the small stage. The music pulsed through his body, reminding him of the first time the alchemist had opened his vein.
"We got a treat for you tonight,"
the DJ said into the microphone.
"Please give it up for Anastasia."
Gillian walked around the stage to the beat of a kick drum. Holding on to the dance pole, she leaned back and looked out over the crowd. The strobe lights flashed on the heart-shaped diamond pendant.
"That girl's something, isn't she?"
Jackson asked the man on the stool next to him, amazed at how Gillian's makeup hid the worst of the damage. Long, white satin gloves covered the places where the flesh had rotted away. She was gorgeous. Jackson remembered how she had looked in high school, back before drinking led to pills, pills to powder, and powder to needles. The man sipped his drink, transfixed on Gillian's swaying hips. She slipped out of her dress, her naked body twisted like a serpent around the pole. Jackson leaned closer to the man, breathing in the smell of cigarettes mixed with cheap cologne.
"Anastasia told me she'd like to get to know you better. She said you could have her. She said you could do whatever you want."
The man sat in silence, still mesmerized. Jackson waited. He knew better than to press. When the song was over, Gillian collected the money on the stage, then walked back behind the red curtain. The man downed the rest of his drink, head bowed and spinning a gold wedding band between his fingers. He seemed to contemplate the offer. After a moment of silence, he whispered,
"How much?"
Smoking a cigarette outside the hotel room door, Jackson listened as the headboard crashed into the wall over and over again. A fake moan of pleasure following each thud. Jackson stared contemptuously at the cars going down the block, the drivers scanning for a date. Everyone knew the place charged by the hour.
"One day, it will all be behind us,"
he thought. He crushed out the cigarette and banged on the door.
"Time's up, pal. Get dressed and get out."
When the headboard continued to thud, but the moaning had stopped, Jackson cursed under his breath.
"God damn it."
He threw open the door, drawing the gun from his waistband, leveling it at the back of the man's head. And he said,
"I told you to get out!"
The man lay on top of Gillian, shaking. She clawed at his back with one hand. Long trails of blood oozed through the sheets. Jackson swung, striking him in the head with the barrel. The man did not stop. Gillian cackled. Her other hand was wrapped around the man's windpipe, holding him on top of her. The man had been struggling to free himself, but was trapped between her legs.
"Let him go!"
She released his neck, thrust her fingers deep into his eye socket, and pulled his face down. The pillows muffled his scream. Jackson grabbed him by the arm and threw him to the floor. Blood flowed down his chest from the puncture wounds in his throat. His dislodged eye rolled across his cheek, dangling by a thread of optic nerves. Gillian lunged after the man. Jackson grabbed her by the hair and threw her back on the bed. A tuft of flesh ripped free from her scalp. Gillian kicked back the bloody sheets and smeared the red gore over her breasts. A low-pitched growl rumbled from her parted lips.
Gillian, stop!
The man tried to pull himself up, but slipped in the growing puddle of blood. The eye slid back and forth across his face.
She tried to kill me.
Jackson kneeled. He pressed his hand to the wound in the man's neck, but when the blood continued to pulse between Jackson's fingers, he shook his head. The man's terrified expression told Jackson that he knew it was the end. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His limp hands fell from Jackson's wrists, and his head lolled forward. The eye in the socket seemed to be locked on Gillian, still rubbing his blood all over her body, while the other stared at the bloody carpet.
Wrap him up in the shower curtain and leave him in the bathroom,
she said.
Why the fuck did you do that?
Jackson clenched his fists. He stood and turned towards her. Gillian traced a bloody circle around her navel.
To feel alive.
I can't help you on my own. We need real help.
Help? I'm okay, Jack. Nana is with me. She was lying in the bed next to me the whole time that monster had his way.
She laughed.
Besides, you can't blame me. Nana told me to do it.
We have to run far, far away. Somewhere people won't know us. Rehab.
Gillian laughed again.
We can get through it if we stay together,
Jackson said. She shook her head.
It's too late for that.
No, it's not. We'll get clean. We'll find work. Rent an apartment. Be a family. Please, Jill. We can break free from this madness.
I said it's too late, Jack. Look.
Gillian held up her left hand, waving it like a magician. With her right, she dug her fingernails into her wrist, hooking a vein with her thumb. She slowly pulled out the long strand, then reached for another. Jackson retched.
Oh my God.
There's no pain. I don't feel anything anymore. Do you want to know the truth about your grandmother, baby?
Gillian caressed the gem around her neck.
Nana told me everything. She was already dead. Had been for a long time before we broke in that night. Now I'm dead too. I'm a monster wearing Gillian's skin. And her rotting flesh itches so badly.
Don't say that! You are just dope sick. We can get through this, I promise. Everything is going to be all right.
Jackson laid his head on her breasts, and she cradled him in her arms. Her body was so cold and her heart beat so slowly that he wasn't sure if he could really hear it at all.
Nana forgives you for what you did. I forgive you too. And I love you, Gillian.
She doesn't forgive me. She said I took away her link to life, and now she's punishing me like a silly child. I don't care, though, because the necklace is mine.
Gillian slid from Jackson's embrace. Blood glistened on her naked body as she limped across the room to her purse. The makeup had been smeared away in different places, exposing the bruised flesh beneath. Jackson could only watch as she cooked up the last bit of her stash and injected it directly into her neck. Pupils constricted to pins. She crawled across the bloody floor like a wounded animal. Jackson cringed as she pulled herself back into the bed and cuddled next to him.
Wake me from the nightmare when you're ready to leave, Jack. We can sell his wedding ring to buy more death.
Jackson held her cold body for hours, staring across the room at the dead man, eyes unblinking. He wasn't sure if the stench came from the corpse or from Gillian. All his life, he had never subscribed to the supernatural. He wanted to believe her affliction was a combination of mental and physical illness, some sort of disease that doctors could treat, though his mind couldn't rationalize the way she had changed. The things he had seen defied all logic. His last hope was to accept that something, some dark force, had power over her.
Gillian,
he whispered. When she didn't respond, he thought of his great-grandmother.
Nana? You were an addict just like the rest of us, weren't you?
He traced the black heart pendant with his finger before gripping it tightly in his palm. Jackson yanked the necklace, breaking the silver chain. Gillian lurched forward, eyes wide and bloodshot. She clawed at her chest, screaming in inhuman retching sounds. Jackson clasped his hands to his ears in an effort to drown out the horror. The piercing howl went on forever. Deja vu struck, and he remembered hearing the same horrific scream from that night. Gillian must have ripped the pendant from Nana's neck. Eventually, her lungs gave way. She sank back to the bed, a slight smile lingering on her blue lips. Jackson pulled her closer. Her muscles clenched under his hands. Spasms contorted her into a twisted mess. Her body twitched and lurched, spine cracking as her back arched further and further backward. After what seemed like an eternity, Gillian finally went still. Jackson cried. He wondered again about the diamond clamped in his hand. It held life somehow. Why would such a thing exist? For what evil purpose? A word passed through his mind, though he didn't know the meaning or where the thought had come from.
Revenant.
Like all addicts, Jackson refused to confront the reality of a lost supply. Wiping away the blood in tears, he said,
I don't care what you are, Jill. I need you.
He told himself that he could learn to control her, to mask the rotting flesh, and to curb her dark urges. He put the pendant back around her neck and waited. When Gillian did not stir, dread set in. He called her name,
Gillian.
But she did not answer.
Gillian.
He shook her,
Gillian.
But she would not wake.
Gillian, come on, baby, please wake up. Come on, come on, come on.
He tried again and again. There was only cold death.
Gillian!
Jackson screamed. He begged for her to come back. He pleaded for the life together that they had always planned.
Stay with me, baby girl.
All the while, he knew it was too late. Hard and fast, they had lived the junkie lifestyle. Their relationship had always been destined to end in suffering.
There has to be a way. There has to be a way. There has to be a way. There has to be a way,
he thought. His mind went through a dozen impossible scenarios, as if life were a fairy tale, and the sleeping princess could still be saved.
Not like this. Not like this. No, not like this.
In the real world, he found only one option. suicide. Jackson placed the gun barrel to his temple. While looking over Gillian's lifeless body, he took in his last breath, his eyes pausing on the sparkling black gem. Suddenly, he knew the answer. Jackson lowered the gun and kissed Gillian for the final time.
This isn't goodbye,
he said, then fled the motel with the heart-shaped pendant firmly grasped in his palm. Jackson stumbled through the dark alleys of a city he no longer recognized. Shuffling through the dredges, he stared at the nickels and dimes in his palm. It wasn't enough, no matter how many times he counted.
25, 50, 75, $5. God fucking damn it. Come on.
It wasn't enough.
Fuck.
The rules had changed. Money could no longer pay for what he needed. Looking for his next fix, he considered breaking into a car, maybe a house. If he could gather the nerve.
No, fucking get caught, come on. I could smash into a car. Still fucking radio. That might work. Yeah, that might work. Yeah, okay.
He thought. The alternative was doing what he had promised himself he would never do again, and the memory brought a horrible taste to his mouth. He shuddered. Promises, after all, were meant to be broken. Now that Jackson no longer used a needle, he simply went through the motions, living life on the streets because it was the only life left for someone like him. He still sought a high, though he had finally come to terms with the fact that it was never the dope he craved. What he needed was something else altogether. His true addiction cost him more and was harder to come by than anything the other wandering addicts could possibly imagine. Each day, he forced himself a little farther down the path to hell for a chance to get closer to the demons he desired. Each deed slightly more horrific. But when the feeling came, Christ, it felt so good. A silhouette appeared in the alley, surrounded by a dim, red glow cast down by the neon sign of the strip club. Jackson stepped back into the cover of darkness, terrified. He listened closely. The figure came toward him, footsteps growing louder and louder, then stopped suddenly in front of the shadow of the dumpster.
Buying or selling?
The man asked. Jackson knew the voice. His heart raced, but he did not move from the darkness.
You can't hide from me.
The voice was gruff, as if the man had smoked 2 lifetimes worth of cigarettes. Jackson was cornered. It was impossible to escape with the way his limbs were shaking. Besides, why run? Nothing could hurt him anymore. He took a hesitant step out of the darkness, feeling the strands of long, dingy hair stuck to his face, wet from perspiration. Or worse. Though his clothing was ragged, the t-shirt and jeans stained so badly that the original colors could not be guessed. Jackson wore the dirty tatters of a brown corduroy jacket, almost proudly.
Buying,
he said.
Oh, you look a mess, boy.
Jackson shrugged. Yes, he was a mess. He should go home and clean up. When had Nana thrown him out, anyway? Months? Years? Or decades ago? He couldn't remember how long he had been on the streets, but he still remembered Nana's expression when she found out Gillian had turned him into a junkie.
Gillian.
The alchemist, much older than Jackson remembered, stared through him with unreadable eyes. Jackson anxiously shifted his weight from foot to foot. The itch was growing stronger, the urge more intense, the scabs on his face driving him insane. He reached up and scratched until his fingers came away wet, exposing the part of skull above his right eye in the process. The alchemist took a step back.
It's been a real long time. Guess you've been shooting up without me.
No.
Then what happened with that girl of yours?
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
The alchemist laughed.
Well, I still got what you need,
he said.
But you ain't got nothing I want,
he added, looking Jackson over from head to toe. Jackson's skin crawled again, but it wasn't from the withdrawals. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. Soon, Jackson thought. The fix is coming soon.
Maybe you do,
the alchemist said, and pointed at Jackson's chest. Jackson looked down at the black heart pendant hanging around his neck. Footsteps approached from behind. Ah, yes. Finally. Nana stepped up to his left, her tongue still pulled through her neck, twitching. Gillian stepped to his right, her head twisted back from rigor mortis, skin several shades of black decay.
What do you say then? Trade?
The alchemist asked, holding up a bag of death.
Do it, Jackie.
Do it. Do it. Do it.
Nana whispered. Gillian's grip tightened on his arm, and in turn, his hand tightened around the pistol.
We're family now, right?
Jackson pleaded, the gun sliding out of his pocket.
Oh, yeah, Jack. Of course we're family.
The alchemist said as he walked toward Jackson, with a needle gripped in a pale, bony hand.
To Be Human. Written by Andrew Harmon. Performed by Tom Merritt. Featuring Jonathan Jones and Alicia Pavlis. Audio production and music by Jeff Clement. Day 1. We called him George on account of his curiosity. He was the first of his kind, as much a social experiment as a scientific one. He could walk, he could talk, he could learn. We consulted with every expert we could think of, from neuroscientists to behavioral analysts to robotics and electrical engineers. And although George was a 4-foot android, he was the closest thing to a son that I had. George had a large, round head and a body like a watermelon. 2 stubby legs supported his squat frame, and he had 2 short arms with big white fingers. He was stocky, but surprisingly dexterous. George was a miracle in machine learning, programmed to emulate humans, but capable of little else. We had wanted to start from square one. No predefined rules or base knowledge. When we first switched George on, we thought that we had failed, because it took him a solid 2 minutes to say a word. His animatronic head swiveled this way and that way, 2 blue LED eyes taking in everything they could find. His first words were,
"What am I?"
Self-reference, straight out of the gate. "You are George," I said.
"I am George,"
he repeated. The days that followed, well, how can I put it all into words? It was a blur of wonder. George paced the floor, learning the names of my colleagues and every color and the names of all the equipment in the lab. When he came upon something new, George would point to it, and we would gift him with a new word. Wash station, and oscilloscope, and servo, and soldering iron grew like seeds in the garden of George's burgeoning vocabulary. We taught him base 10 counting, we taught him basic mathematics, and soon his digital brain could compute faster than ours. But our true intention was to impart to George the concept of humanity, and that sort of metaphysical idea simply cannot be taught in a stifled laboratory. George's public debut was set to take place at the International Conference on AI and Robotics in San Diego, and we were quite wary about the possibility that the news of the world's most cutting-edge artificial intelligence platform might be leaked ahead of schedule. I was due for a vacation at the time, so I saw no issue in bringing George along for the ride when my wife and I drove off to her parents' wooded property on Carlisle Lake in southern Illinois. It would, we figured, certainly hide George's existence from spying eyes. My wife, Chelsea, was a dazzling woman, and by far the most wonderful human I had come across. She would, I felt confident, be a perfect example for George to follow. Chelsea was 7 months pregnant at the time, and so eager for our first child to be born that I figured she would get a real kick out of caring for our robot son for a couple weeks. And in our Carlisle Lake cabin, I could teach George all about the natural world. Day 3. The drive from New York to Illinois was long, but peaceful. George sat in the back seat, pointing out the window at the world flying past him. It zoomed by so quickly that he did not have time to ask me to name something before it was gone. My wife was not as pleased with my decision as I anticipated. Perhaps it was because George fell into that uncanny valley between familiar yet disturbingly different, a fairly common complaint issued by people regarding humanoid robots. "He's kind of cute though, right?" I said.
"Its eyes freak me out. Why does it keep staring at me?"
she asked. "George is just curious. Isn't that right, George?"
"Absolutely,"
George exclaimed, though his inflection fell a bit flat. Absolutely was a word I used profusely in the lab, and George had taken it up as his catchphrase. We arrived at the charming little cabin on Sunday afternoon, and the scene was picturesque. Leaves were budding in the trees, and the grassy fields had a breath of fresh green in them. The water of Carlisle Lake lapped lazily at the banks just down the hill. Birds whistled away as we unloaded the sedan, me doing most of the work as Chelsea had become permanently sore through her last trimester. Meanwhile, George was lumbering around the yard, his optic sensors overloaded by the vastness of Mother Nature. Though struggling with our bags, I did my best to answer his flurry of questions as best I could. "Illinois," I told him. "Trees," I said. "Grass. Birds. Gravel. Cabin." His inquisitiveness delighted me, but I could sense that Chelsea was quickly growing irritated. I would like to say that we settled in for a romantic night in seclusion, but a busy man's life is never that simple. We had not been in the cabin more than 4 hours when the office called. A dire situation was unfolding, and my presence was mandatory. Chelsea just sighed. She had been through this so many times before.
"There's no point arguing with you, James,"
she said. She ran a washcloth under warm water and swept it across her forehead. Rather melodramatically, I thought.
"Your work is your life, not me. So just go."
I will not go into the details of the fight that ensued. There were accusations and name-callings and bouts of crying. When it was all said and done, I assured her that I would return on Tuesday. I pleaded for her understanding. It is just a couple days. Then I will hop on a plane right back to you. I promise.
What about him?
Chelsea said, gesturing towards George. Training. For when this one comes. I smiled, brushing my palm over her swollen stomach.
That thing is not my child,
she said. She opened the pantry and took out a loaf of bread and peanut butter for sandwiches, then slammed it shut.
I'll make sure it doesn't break, but that's about it.
Day 5. I was in Terminal 2 in the San Francisco airport on Tuesday, awaiting my return flight. I called Chelsea to let her know I would be boarding soon and to ask how things were going at the cabin. She said that she was getting bored being alone and asked if I would pick up extra groceries. She craved frozen pizza. And what about George? I asked.
I tried to let him cook with me, but he just kept asking what food was and why I had to eat and to describe taste. How the hell do you describe what taste is? When he learned he couldn't eat, he lost interest.
She said.
So I just stuck him in front of the television and he hasn't budged since.
Television? Genius, Chelsea, I cried. He will have constant human interaction. He'll get to explore the depths of emotion and human interaction. What is he watching right now?
I don't know.
She said.
Baywatch, I think?
Well, I suppose he gets to learn about human sexuality as well. I smiled into the phone and whispered, maybe you and I can take a refresher course of our own when I get back tonight. She did not find my suggestiveness as amusing as I did. Soon after that, I was boarding my plane and twiddling my fingers impatiently on the armrest through the whole flight. I landed in St. Louis, took the shuttle to the rental car, and drove back across the river into Illinois and my planned vacation. When I arrived at the cabin, I spotted George standing down next to the lake, his white polymer body hunched over a bucket. I hurried over, worried that he might fall into the water and fry himself. The stench of fish in the air rattled me when I came close. George had scooped himself up a bucket of pond water with dozens of silvery minnows darting about inside. The grass all around George was strewn with dead fish and tiny splatters of their innards. What on earth are you doing? I asked, more intrigued than upset.
These people were drowning,
George droned. Why, these are not people, George. They're fish. They do not drown. They live in water, I said.
Fish,
he repeated. He stared down into the bucket, his bulbous white head processing the concept of living beings thriving in water.
Teach me to perform CPR.
I looked at the tiny corpses littering the grass around me. Their stomachs had all been pressed and dented in by George's unfeeling fingers. Was he acting out what he had seen on TV? Had he tried to save them all from drowning? Was this his attempt at CPR? His white fingertips were smeared in red. Day 6. After the fish incident, Chelsea and I decided it would be best to subject George to more wholesome educational programming. He seemed quite confident to sit in front of the television set for hours on end, soaking up like a sponge every word that the drab documentary narrator spoke. I had been in such a hurry to get back to my Chelsea that I'd forgotten all about the trip to the store. The nearest market was half an hour away, so I kissed my wife's forehead and pulled on a hat before heading out again to procure the groceries. Chelsea stayed behind, sipping tea on the porch's rocking bench. As my sour luck would have it, the front left tire on our rental car went flat halfway into town. We were too deep in the middle of nowhere to get cell phone reception, so I had to hoof it. I knew Chelsea would be furious that I was taking so long, but what was I to do? A quick trip to the grocery store stretched into a several-hour debacle, and by the time I got home, Chelsea had already eaten her dinner and left mine cold on the plate. I felt that we were on the brink of another fight, so to defuse the situation, I suggested we take a stroll through the woods, alone. We left George in front of the TV set with images of Amazonian birds and squirrel monkeys flashing before his eyes. It was a cool, peaceful night, and so our walk turned into an evening entirely spent on the porch with a small fire crackling in the pit. Chelsea went to bed after a while, but I stayed up a little longer to study the stars. Time and fatigue eventually got the best of me, and I dozed off for an hour or two before I woke up cold and slinked back into the house. Perhaps the most disconcerting aspect of George is the fact that he does not sleep. It was well past midnight when I came in, and George's blue eyes glowed just as voraciously as the nature documentary before him. On the screen, a trio of lions lounged in the tall grass, their black lips stained with fresh blood. Behind them lay a zebra's carcass, picked clean, its yellow bones spackled in biting flies. George heard me trudging through the living room. When I paused behind the couch, his round head turned 180 degrees on his shoulders, and he stared right at me.
Teach me about death,
he said. Day 7. After breakfast, I noticed that George was not glued to the couch as he had been when I had left him the night before. I finished my coffee and pulled on my boots, then set out to figure out to where he might have roamed off. I would be lying to say I wasn't nervous. This was a multi-million-dollar android, and I realized I had been acting quite carelessly with him. I found George squatting in the trees not far from the back porch. The odor of rotting flesh overwhelmed me as I approached. George did not seem to pay me any mind. He was staring down at a dead raccoon. Morning dew was glistening on its mottled fur, signaling that it had been there overnight. Did you do this, George?
What is the purpose of dying?
George asked. Well, it is not really something we intend to do. It just happens, I answered.
Will I die as well?
No, George, you will not die, per se. You are not exactly living in the first place.
Okay,
George said flatly. He reached a hand down and kneaded the dead animal's ribcage.
And what is the purpose of killing?
We do not kill, George, I was quick to answer. We never kill.
Animals kill,
George said.
People kill in wars. Why do they do this?
Well, wars are complicated. When people really want something badly enough, they kill other people to get it.
Absolutely,
George said. I took George back into the house, careful not to mention anything to Chelsea about the raccoon just yet. She was already freaked out by George, and I didn't want to exacerbate things. We turned off the television and let him tag along with us as we happily frittered the day away. That night, Chelsea and I decided on a name for the baby. Matthew. Day 8. In a decision I regretted almost immediately, I caved over breakfast and told Chelsea about the raccoon and the minnows. She got sick at the idea. She called him a cold, emotionless machine and implored me to shut him off before he got any more ideas about death. I reassured her that George was harmless. She spent most of the day in bed. In the early evening, Chelsea's mother called. They lived an hour from the cabin in Hillsborough, and they needed someone there immediately. Chelsea's father had fallen in the shower and refused to call an ambulance or ask the neighbors for help. He was a proud man struggling to adjust to old age. Her mother was too weak to get him up by herself, but she had convinced him to let us help. I agreed that we would be right there to assist, but Chelsea was feeling too sick for a long car ride. I certainly did not want to bring the culture shock of a talking robot into her elderly parents' home. Though Chelsea protested the idea of being left alone with George, I came up with a solution. We should teach him morality. I sat George in front of the television again and flipped to a channel on the far end of the spectrum that played nothing but televangelist sermons and gospel choirs. Surely he could learn right from wrong this way, and Chelsea would be free to spend the night as she pleased. Before I left, she retired to the bedroom and locked herself in. I thought she was silly for being afraid of harmless little George. I crouched down in front of the couch and said to George, I have to go for a few hours. You sit right here and watch only this channel, okay? These shows will teach you human morality. You want to be more human, correct?
Absolutely,
George said. Day 9. How could I have been so blind, so ignorant? This next part is hard for me to write. I guess I should start by explaining what George had calculated in my absence. Hours upon hours of sermons filled his digital brain with ideas of souls and paradise and hell and demons. The white-haired preachers told George that only righteous souls could go to the good place. Everyone else went to a bad place. A terrible, awful place. And while George did not understand the concepts of heaven and hell, He was certain that he would prefer to go to good places. George recalled the day with the raccoon when I explained that he was not a living thing, that he would not die. And the preachers were steadfast in their assertion that one must first die to go to the good place. If George had any chance of living, and therefore any chance of dying, and even still a chance of going to the good place, he would first need a soul. The preachers smiled their confident, dimpled smiles and told George that a soul was created at birth. If George was to have a soul, he reasoned, he needed to be birthed. I came in early the next morning, around 4 o'clock. The trip had taken much longer than I expected. Instantly, I noted the darkness and silence and saw the television had been turned off, and George no longer resided on the couch. Passing through the kitchen, I saw that the fillet knife was missing from the cutlery block. The door to our bedroom was ajar. I pushed it open with quivering hands. My deepest, most hideous fear lay before me. Chelsea was sprawled atop the mattress, her arms thrown out to her sides, her legs twisted up beneath her, her eyes empty and lifeless. White sheets were wet with her blood. George lay curled beside her, pushing his cold frame into her side. Beside him, the fillet knife dripped red. He had sliced my poor Chelsea from the base of the sternum down to her pelvis and pried her open. His white hands were bright red where he had pushed them inside of her and made room for himself. He made room for himself beside Matthew. Did you really do this? I stammered. I collapsed in the doorway, unable to look away from the nightmarish tableau, and clasped my hand over my mouth. I tasted vomit in my throat.
Absolutely,
George repeated. Why? Why would you do this? Dear God. George lifted his head off the sheets and stared at me with those pitiless, unblinking blue eyes.
I wanted something badly. I killed to get it.
I hurled bile right there on the floor. My whole body shook violently. I wanted to march across the room and bash George to oblivion. I wanted to cave in his round white head. I wanted to rip out his circuitry and motherboards and wires. But I couldn't even stand. You did all of this to be human?
Absolutely.
We called him George on account of his curiosity.
tales for dark nights.